Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to this session on rapid evolution. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Jill Jenkinson and Zara Whysall today for this webinar. Just a bit of housekeeping up front to let you know that we'll be sending out the slides after the session, as well as a recording, so that will be available to you following the webinar. We do have some sort of designated points where we'll be asking questions, but we'd encourage you to use the chat functionality throughout. Anything that you want to ask, please feel free to pop it in there as we go along. We'll do our best to answer as much as we can in the session, and anything that we don't get to today, we'll make sure to come back to you at a later date. So, as I said, we are joined today by Zara Whysall and Jill Jenkinson, who will be running this session. So I will hand over to Jill to get us started today.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll introduce myself, and I know Zara will when she takes over. So I'm the Chief Exec of T3 and Kiddy and Partners, and we're two organisations, one focusing on assessment and one focusing on the development of leaders and culture. So you'll probably see the relevance of that as we go through and talk about what we want to talk to you about today, which is rapid evolution. And I'll leave Zara to tell you a little bit about herself and her role in this. Could I have the next slide, Emily? So I guess one of the things that as an organisation that we're really curious about and very committed to is the role of research and where research fits. And as COVID came and went and we sort of came out of it, we started to ask a lot of questions of ourselves around, organisations, how have they experienced it? How are they now experiencing things? And what are the organisations that actually have, over the last few years, COVID and beyond and before, who have actually sort of really grown beyond market expectations, beyond their competitors, beyond sometimes even their own expectations. And we were particularly interested in organisations that had grown for a period of time, rather than organisations that had, grown associated with a particular product. So we asked ourselves those questions, and as a result of that, Zara and myself and a small team decided to embark on some research to actually dig into this a little bit more and say, what is it? Who are those organisations? What kind of growth have they seen? Why was it faster than anybody else's? And what can we learn from it? And in doing that, we were focused on two questions. Next slide, please, Emily. And those questions really were, what can we learn from research, from literature, from articles, the quantitative stuff, but also from those organisations about what has helped them to grow, what steps have they taken, what characteristics do they have? And I guess we were looking at organisations that have achieved success over a sustained period of time and accelerated that growth, but also maybe learning from organisations that have achieved growth, but then sometimes actually it sort of then descended. So that sort of positive and the negative deviance. And we were curious about those organisations. So we looked at them, we found some really, really interesting data. And now we want to talk to you about that and share that with you. And I'm going to hand over to Zara, who's very much involved in the research and driving that forward. Thanks, Zara.
Thanks, Jill. Hi, everyone. So my role across Kiddy and T3 is to basically pull that research out of academia, find out what works, what doesn't work, what might help our clients, and then make it tangible, turn it into something practical and reasonable. So Jill threw down the gauntlet with this challenge to find out what is it that hinders or helps organisations with that transformation and that growth. So it's been a really interesting journey, I'd say, in researching this. I'm really excited to share that with you today. We'll keep an eye on the chat. So if anybody does want to pop any questions in the chat, then please do. I'll just, as I say, keep an eye on that. But we will largely, often we do try to make these interactive, but we're conscious that sometimes, especially at this time of day, you're not really prepared for that. You might be eating your lunch and don't necessarily want us to suddenly say, right, we're going into breakout. So by all means, feel free to unmute yourself and have a chat, or just put questions in the chat. So what did we find with this research then? So first thing that we discovered, Emily, if you could move to the next slide, please, thanks. The most interesting thing for me initially in looking at the academic research on this is that the companies most at risk of stalling, of getting stuck, whether that's in terms of wanting to grow, whether that's in terms of wanting to transform, is the fact that it's large organizations, it's successful organizations that tend to be at the biggest risk of this. And then, of course, subsequent decline. In a minute, I'm going to ask if you can tell me which company that graph relates to. So feel free to get thinking about that. But the reason for why it's successful organizations that are particularly at risk for this is quite a lot about the fact that they, once you have grown and become quite big, it means that it's more likely that you don't change fast enough. There's lots getting in your way. You know, you're bigger, you're more wieldy, lots of red tape, lots of internal process. So not changing fast enough. But also there's a lot about the fact that past success generates certain behaviours and mindsets, which can get in the way of change and limit sort of what we might be able to achieve in terms of growth or transformation. Because obviously the world out there is changing. You know, it's not stopping. That pace of change will continue. And of course, if you've been successful in the past, you can get quite protective over that, over continuing that, you know, protecting what we've achieved so far, not wanting to let go perhaps of how we've done things in the past. So we'll come back to those biases and mindsets as we go through. So in terms of examples, the companies you see here, the company that you see here is often used as an example of a once really successful organization that then, you know, had a really significant decline and actually then, you know, pretty much disappeared. So looking at the date line along the bottom, anyone hazard a guess? Pop it in the chat as to which company this is. I'll keep talking and let you know anyway. So tech organization, as I say, often cited as an example of a once very successful company who failed to adapt. Martine's typing. Thanks, Martine. I'll keep an eye on it as I continue to Dixon's. Oh, that's a really good suggestion, because I wonder if their data might look very similar. It's not Dixon's, but that's a very good example of a similar company. So this is a global organization, global tech. And as you can see, the market share fell from over 50%. They had over 50% of the market share in their category in 2007, and that declined to 3% of global sales by mid-2013. So really, really shocking. So Emily, if you press move forwards, we will see. Yeah, so it's Nokia. So there's lots of research that's been done about what went wrong at Nokia. And what you'll find is that it's not to do with their tech, really. It's not to do with their technical know-how or, you know, having the best product developers. It came down largely to leadership decisions, the decisions they made, the options they took or didn't take. So really important, I think, and interesting for people like us. So, for instance, they are, you know, highlighted as having really slow, ineffective decision making, lack of accountability, insipid innovation, lack of collaboration, all of these sorts of things that I'm sure you all face challenges with in your own companies day in, day out. So I think what was really interesting for me in embarking on this was that when you look at growth and transformation and evolution of companies, often you think, it's probably largely due to ineffective, you know, business models or managing their finances or product development. Well, actually, the research shows a lot of it is down to leadership, down to the sorts of things, leadership behaviours and mindsets, the sorts of things within our gift to try to influence. So really interesting. So the second thing that I found, Emily, if you could just move to the next slide, was that growth stalls are very common. So most large and, as I said, successful organizations will experience growth stalls or, you know, getting stuck in some way in their lifetime, of the company. That is, if they don't go out of business before that. So there's some fantastic research looking at the whole of the Fortune 100 companies over 50 years. 87% of them got stuck at least once. So it's likely that this will happen if you're in a large organization. And when that happened, they lost 74% of their market capitalization. So not only is it really common, but it's absolutely catastrophic. So almost wipes out most of their value. But the good news is that it's avoidable. So as I said, most of the reasons for this, for getting stuck, for stalling growth, and I'd say also for transformation, is that it comes down to those leadership decisions, choices that we make, how we organize ourselves and the organization. And the three graphs that you see there really kind of highlight the main point that they concluded with this analysis of these companies. So what we usually expect when we think about wanting to grow and transform and all of those good things is what you see at the top. So we think, oh, there's going to be an initial plod, it's going to be some hard work, and there'll be some slow initial wins, but then it's going to take off. And it'll be wonderful. But that's not what happens. The reality is what you see in the middle. The reality is it's easy to grow when you're smaller, to make those initial advances, but then it gets harder. As you get larger, it gets much harder, and many companies see that stalling, that getting stuck. But what we need to move towards is this concept of rapid evolution. So change needs to be not just a one-off, something that we do when we notice we're getting stuck, we're behind the market, whatever it might be as your indicators of being stuck. It needs to be this continual evolution. We need to be continually looking at what's going on and how can we adapt. So that's kind of the context for what we started finding when we looked at that research. And we tried to consolidate all of these interesting findings from the academic and the case study examples in terms of the research. And we pulled it into some key principles. So on the next slide, you'll see 5 key principles that really just sum up the key underpinning of what we'll talk to you about over the next half hour or so. So the first one relates to what I was just saying, really. Change can no longer be a one-off. It has to be something we do continually. We know, about the pace of change. We know it's not going to stop. And we also know that people are feeling very fatigued. And that's because we're switching change on and then we're switching it off. We're saying, let's do a program on change, and then it's not. And then there's another program on change. So what we need to shift towards instead is change just becoming something that we do. You are what you do continually. So let's just have that mindset and embed it in what we do. The second thing is that the companies who do this really well, even as they grow, the leaders resist what happens typically when organizations get large, which is all of that red tape, the burden, too much process. Of course, we need process, we need to get professional, we need to, as organizations grow, but it's keeping that mindset of, act small, have that sort of entrepreneurial mindset, and we'll talk to you about a few ways of doing that shortly. The third thing is fast, slow. So transformation, growth, all of those things can't be continual because humans will just tire. We will just get tired, we'll get fatigued, but also it's not the most effective approach. So it might be that you need to take the foot off the gas in order to have a look outside, have a look at the market, have a look at what's going on. Is this still the right path? Is this still the right trajectory, the right strategy? So it's a matter of varying the pace and the intensity of that. So the fourth key principle is less is more. So what's clear from many of the case studies is that organizations who do this well are very clear on the small number of priorities that they are going after. They don't try to do everything all at once. Okay, so they declutter. Let's get rid of the things that are holding us back, that are overcomplicating us and slowing us down. So less is definitely more. And then the fifth principle there, so tension, create the energy for change. Comfort, I think, is possibly the worst enemy. It's what gets us into that plateau state. So just being comfortable, we're doing okay, we've been quite successful, everything is ticking along. Because of course the environment, the external environment will change around us. Competitors will do different things. So that comfort and complacency is actually a real risk. So hence what we're going to talk to you about is, what does that tension look like? How can we balance those tensions? And there's some key tensions that we've identified to help you do that. So, Emily, moving on to talk about the tensions. I'll just pause there, Jill, just in case you've got anything that you're burning to add in at that stage. And because people might have had enough of hearing my voice for a while.
No, I think it's interesting because when we embarked upon the research, we kind of wondered what would come out. Would it be a sort of list of characteristics or a sort of, fallback box quadrant? But actually, what came out really interestingly was that it wasn't an organisation's ability to get things right, one thing right or another thing right. It was an ability to be able to live with and get the right balance between things in organisations that have to be tensions. Because if you don't get tension and create tension, you don't get people feel uncomfortable, and therefore you don't get people engaging in the change. So it was interesting that we didn't necessarily get what we expected, but what we got was, I think, something more interesting around this sort of how do you balance as a leader, how do you balance as an organisation, things which are inherent tensions.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. It's a good point. And I was really grateful that when I started sharing this back with you and we started working through these tensions, that your view on this was, this is not simple. This is not kind of a simplistic solution, but you could see how it's obvious that a simple solution isn't going to address this properly. So it's about balancing these tensions. It's not one simple approach that will, magically fix this for every company. That would just be way too simplistic. So we'll just talk you through these tensions here and try to sort of bring out some practical examples as well as to what does that actually look like. So the overarching tension that kind of underpins all of them to some degree is this overarching principle of fix the vision but flex the journey. So of course we all know the importance of vision, and that absolutely came out in terms of change because and for those of you with a psychology background, you'll get this, because change, the brain doesn't respond well to change, does it? It feels threatened often by change, and it can feel quite bewildering. The brain is always looking for certainty and being able to predict what's happening next. So vision helps us do that. A vision is constant. A vision is that North Star, isn't it? It's something that we can point to that's continuous and reassuring for people. So that is the constant, and it's really important. And I think, theoretically we know it's important, but practically we forget often to give it as much attention as it warrants. And I, have been with leadership teams and mentioned this, and they've said, oh God, that's a really good point. And even amongst themselves, what's the vision? It's about, such and such, isn't it? And then somebody else goes, well, isn't it that? And so, really important to make sure, do people actually know what the vision is? Do they actually find it motivating? Is it motivating? Is it genuinely exciting? Through all of this turmoil and change, is it something that's going to keep them going and keep them wanting to commit to this journey? But of course, as I've said a number of times already, there will need to be adaptation, because the journey needs to flex, because the environment will change. We can't predict everything. But of course, that vision is long term, it's high level. It's the journey, how we're going to get there, exactly what we're going to do, the path we're going to take needs to flex. So that agility and flex the journey, really important. So let's just reflect on that for a minute. Emily, if you just move to the next slide, we've put some questions that you could just take away, really, to reflect to yourself about each tension. Okay, what do I need to think about then in relation to that? Jill, anything you want to add at that point, just in terms of what you see?
No, and I think it's building on what Zara talked about there in terms of leadership teams. I think it's very easy to sort of know that we've got a vision or a purpose and kind of assume that everybody gets it. But I think people, when there's a lot of change and people are uncomfortable, that's when actually the vision starts to get a bit murky for them, and they disconnect with it, and suddenly they don't feel that they're clear on why they're doing it or ultimately why they're doing it. And also, I think in our language, we often stop referring to it. So really, if we've got a really clear, compelling thing in front of us, kind of every decision we make or every rationale we give comes back to that. And I think sometimes as leaders in organisations, we forget to do that. We think it's implicit, but it's often not for people. So I think it's really powerful if you get it right, and it's actually really messy if you don't.
Yeah,
So
good
these
point.
sorts of questions are really about, is it doing the job it should be doing for you, or is it not?
Yeah, and the third one that you'll see there is about actually questioning. There are often in every company unquestioned beliefs, things that we just take for granted, that of course that's the best way to do this. Of course that's in the strategy. Of course we're going to do that. And it's again about making sure that we're not being complacent around those things that we might actually need to flex. You know, let's say our history is this, doing this in this way, but do we need to flex the journey in future because of the way that things are moving and evolving? Fantastic. Thanks, Jill. So the second tension, which you would have seen there, it's between productive paranoia on the one hand, which is about looking outside at the external environment and questioning, versus courageous conviction. So I'll just talk you through that briefly before introducing what's going on with this graph that you see here. So productive paranoia is so important because as organizations grow, your focus tends to turn internally, because there's so much to sort out, isn't there, in growing an organization. And as it gets bigger, so many more internal processes, many more internal people. So naturally focus gets more focused on the inside of the organization than the outside. And of course, in a fast changing organization, that is quite risky. So the organizations that do this really well, they don't lose that external focus. They're constantly looking outside, looking towards the horizon. What's coming down the tracks? What are our competitors doing? You know, what's going on in the environment? What new technology is coming out that we might be able to take advantage of? So always that questioning. But of course, it's in tension because we can't question forever. We're not going to be a successful organization if all we do is question. You know, and it's called productive paranoia because it's not just being paranoid and questioning, but it's in a productive way. Oh, how could we take advantage of that new tech that's come out? So in a positive way. But it has to be balanced with courageously, having courageous conviction to commit to something. We can't be asking and questioning forever. We need to commit to some things and to some small priorities that we're really confident on, and to not dither and stick our toe in the water, but to go quite boldly and drive forwards against those small number of priorities. So that's the courageous conviction. No, we're committing to this. We'll still keep one eye looking outside, questioning, but for now we're committing to this and we are going to go with confidence at it. So that's the principle. The graph that you see here. So again, I'm going to be interested to see if anyone could guess who this is while I'm talking. Let me just move back so I can see the chat. So this is an organisation. Again, focus on the timeline here because that's very relevant. This is their data in terms of how they're doing on the S&P. Oh, good guess, Martine. You are very close with Zoom. It's certainly related to the pandemic and certainly benefited from that. And you can see their growth compared to the typical Dow Jones or S&P. Let me just see, it's good, but it's not right, correct. So they had astronomical growth, really, really rapid growth compared to everybody else, the market average that you see at the bottom there. So yeah, Martin's close with Zoom. So it's not a tech company, but they certainly had a massive boom in the pandemic when people were shut in their houses. It's tech enabled, I would say. Any other guesses before I move on? When with Airbnb also close, but I think they did struggle in early lockdown because they all got shut down. But good, but similar. So I suppose in the terms of that crowdsourcing using technology. So Emily, if you click forwards one, we will see it's Peloton. So also what you see here is how hard it is to sustain growth and transformation at the that they were going at initially. And this is a really interesting case study of that productive paranoia. So of course, Peloton, well, they were growing already and were tipped to do wonderful things before the pandemic. But of course, in the pandemic, nobody could go to the gym. They had a huge boost, but their business model was good already. They recognized that people couldn't get into gym classes in cities like New York. So the concept was already good. Anyway, huge growth, as you see there. And what they did there was they kind of went head down, focused internally. Right, let's get our operations, our manufacturing. They invested huge amounts into their own manufacturing facilities and their supply chain to try to respond to the huge volumes of orders that they were getting. Of course, what happened in the meantime was that orders slowed, and then therefore you see this subsequent and quite catastrophic decline. I think they're still struggling to recover. CEO ended up having to step down. So, you know, really challenging. 2 points that this makes here is the importance of looking outside, thinking about what's going on in the external environment, and therefore not getting too carried away internally, adjusting your plans, but also sustaining that growth or transformation is a huge challenge. So in terms of the sorts of questions that you might want to ask yourselves on this tension, what have we got, Emily, on the next slide? Just see. So Jill, anything that you would pull out initially in terms of this tension?
I mean, I think that what was significant in the research was the distinction between organisations who got this right versus didn't, because I think it is organisations have invested a lot in trying to gather ideas, involve people in that. So around the paranoia and that area, I think people have put mechanisms in to try and reach into the organisation and outside to get those ideas. But what the research shows and what we see in reality is that the bit that falls in the middle is the bit between, right, we've got some great ideas, so what are we actually going to do with them? You know, so either the danger is you try and do 25 things and none of them hit the mark, or none of them actually get any momentum because it's just too many, or there's a lot of time spent trying to gather more evidence before we actually do anything. And sometimes that loses so much momentum. By the time you wake up, the competition are, you know, 2 steps ahead. So I think there is something about our own reluctance to sort of say, right, we're going to go with that one. So, you know, the ready, fire, aim, as opposed to, you know, get it all to be perfect, get all your evidence lined up. Sometimes it is more about experimentation and ready, fire, aim, get a few things going, monitor the results really carefully and see what is going to, you know, see what the early results are indicating. So I think it's interesting where it falls down for many different organisations.
Yeah, you're right, because people who hedge and try to spread their resources across multiple so-called priorities, but, you know, it makes people question really which are our priorities. There's so many things, you know, they've got too many things going. Of course, they can't move fast or go with as much conviction against all of them. You simply can't move fast on everything. Yeah, so you're right, that was really interesting in terms of the companies that were quite bold. In fact, I saw a really good interview with a leader who said something along the lines of, sometimes people think that being bold is doing lots of things, whereas actually being bold is doing few things and saying no to many other things, but we're going to go really hard and really confidently on these small number of priorities. So yeah, how many priorities do you have? Where's your focus internally, externally? But also, on the contrary, that second sort of question to reflect on there points to the fact, or are we being too conservative in some areas? You know, should we have more confidence and go, you know, more concertedly towards, you know, certain areas and really trying to lead in those? So yeah, interesting area. So moving on. So the third tension, Jill just alluded to some of it there. So between fearless experimentation on the one hand, and then making some sharp decisions on the other hand. So we'll just talk through that briefly before going into the example that you see. So fearless experimentation, again, this comes down to fail fast, you know, try lots of things on a small scale, fail fast and move on. Okay, so it's about taking some risks on a small scale. It's about figuring out what might work, testing lots of different things, because, as I said, it comes back to this environment that we're in, which is quite unpredictable. It's changing rapidly. So hence the need for that testing, that those innovations, not all of them will pay off, but we need to know when to stop. and when to make a decision about which are we going to move forwards with, and that can't be all of them. So the sharp decisions is really important. So actually, I'll just come onto the bit in yellow first. So some really interesting examples from case studies about how decision making and poor or slow decision making, one of the main, I would say, problems in leadership teams when it comes to this going wrong. So there's just a few biases there that you may see getting in the way in this regard. So status quo bias, of course, we're naturally conservative. We look for stability. We look to take the easy option, but also risk aversion, sunk costs fallacy, all of these things that make us hang on to things for too long. So I really like the phrase "change before you have to." It absolutely resonates in this context of rapid, high-speed change. You have to change before it's absolutely obvious that things are on the decline, because by then it's quite hard to try to catch up again or to try to, get back to where you were. And often we hang on to things for too long, especially if they've been successful for us in the past. So it's about letting go. It's about making decisions not informed by emotion too much, combating that risk aversion. Now, the graph on the left, so this is a nice example from Tesco, there's a really good example of how they did this testing, this experimentation really well with Tesco Express as a format. So, of course, they were the first people to introduce that format and have done it really successfully. And what they did was exactly that. It was like a mini experiment, the way that they introduced. So they started with a few formats of Tesco Express, and they kept changing it and seeing how customers responded, seeing what format worked best, then changing it, then tweaking it, then looking at the data, looking at how people found the experience, changing it, tweaking it. So very almost like a controlled experiment. And it clearly worked out very well for them. The world's third largest grocer, I was surprised to find out. But in contrast to it, clearly a different team led what they did with Fresh and Easy. So this turned out to be a loss-making sort of part of their business in the US. They ended up having to sell it for a loss. So not only, did they lose whilst they were in ownership of it, but the disposal cost Tesco over 200 million, added to 1.5 billion cumulative losses they'd already racked up whilst it was not being very effective. So what they did here was they didn't do that sort of test things, adapt things, test things, adapt things. They kind of just ignored the learn by doing approach, launched in thinking it was silver bullet approach, but it didn't work out for them. So it's all about that fail fast, learn. What is it? Fail fast, basically learn quickly, fail fast, try lots of options, but keep evolving and adapting. So yeah, really interesting. I think Jill and I get quite excited about this area, don't we? We find it really interesting. So what sort of questions might you ask yourselves in terms of how is this panning out in our organisation at the moment? So are there things that you're hanging on to that perhaps you need to let go of? And that could be, it doesn't necessarily need to relate to products or services, ways of doing things also, ways of doing things, how we go about doing things, how we're collaborating, how we're structuring ourselves. Anything. Are we hanging on to some things that we need to let go of to move forwards? Jill, sorry, anything that you
I mean, I just remember one of the case studies, and one of the really tangible things that they looked at was how cluttered decision making and meeting forums were around certain areas. So there was almost this need for everybody to be involved around the table on particular things. And actually, when they experimented and freed that up and just got a very few people with delegated accountability, it made a huge difference to the pace in which things moved, but also to the quality of the conversation, because it wasn't always catching everybody up. And I suppose it challenged the concept that people just had to be at a meeting to be there to cover people's back. So sometimes Zara's absolutely right, it's the ways of working, and when you look at that and you see the crowds that gather around particular things, you do really have to question the effectiveness of that as an end result.
Yeah, that's cited in Nokia for sure. One of the huge reasons for their downfall, just having committees making every decision, not being bold enough to empower people to sort of push that a bit further down the chain, those decision-making powers. Yeah, really good point. And the second point also, risk taking. Should we be taking some more risks in some areas, but obviously on a small scale, testing it out, and again, that can be ways of working, most recent example being hybrid working. I wonder how many people have actually tested out different options properly before settling on an option, or just staying with what we got stuck with following the pandemic. Okay, so if anyone, by the way, has any questions, feel free to keep typing them in to the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. Otherwise, we'll just keep talking, because we could talk forever on this topic. So the fourth tension. So this is another interesting one. So it's a tension between enlightened empathy, and we'll explain what we mean by that, and taking a leap of faith. So enlightened empathy, it's about really understanding your stakeholders. So obviously that can be customers, service users, whoever they are, but also it's your employees. It's on both sides, internally and externally. Do we really understand our people? Because coming back to the pandemic, when something like that happens, when you have to reorientate really quickly, you need to know how people are going to feel about this without having the time to go and ask, to go and consult. You need to know, you need to really understand how would they respond to this? Where are they at currently? Are their preferences, wants, needs changing? To really have your finger on the pulse of that. So often that is data. It means having good data on colleagues, employees, and customers, service users, etc. But it's also going beyond the data to really make sure that you understand them. How long ago, I think this is probably one of the questions that I'm jumping ahead to, but how long ago was it that some of your leaders actually went and spent a day with whoever your your customer or key stakeholder is, to make sure that every decision truly is driven by those key stakeholder needs, because every company says they are, don't we? I think we all say, yes, every decision is driven by our stakeholders, but is it really? I think the bigger we get, we kind of, can get a little bit separated from that. And also to make sure that the data that we're using, which of course is a proxy of how people are feeling, is it still an accurate representation of that? Is it still an accurate reflection of that? Because if there's been a shift in that, that's really dangerous, because we're using this data as a reliable source of how they're feeling. And if it no longer is, then we've got a false sense of security there. So it's that enlightened empathy, really understanding what's going on for people. But in contrast to that, if we only ever made any decisions or moved forwards with any plans based on what the data is telling us, then we'd never do anything different. We'd never do anything innovative, new, interesting. So thinking of Apple, an obvious example here, who launched products that people weren't saying they wanted because they didn't know they wanted them. They didn't exist yet. We couldn't even conceive of them. Yet they used that data of what people were saying that they wanted, but they combined that with their own expertise, but also that bit of creativity. So we've got to, bring in some of that creativity if we want to try to get ahead of the curve. We've got to add that little sparkle of genius in it, or take a leap of faith to really take advantage of what might be. And that's what's reflected in the graph here. Jill might be able to add more into this. But because data is always backward looking. So if we only ever follow what the data is telling us, then we're likely to kind of follow a relatively constrained trajectory of improvement or growth. Whereas it's that creativity that will help us, leap forwards, take a real introduce a real step change and leap ahead. Jill, do you want to add anything on it?
I mean, I think the only thing to add is what the data was also interesting around was the sort of impact on staff and leadership. So in the same way that you have enlightened empathy around customers, if you really, really do know and are deeply connected to your people, then it encourages you to take a leap of faith. Because actually the two go together, because sometimes, you don't know with certainty that promoting someone or advancing them is going to work. But if you really understand what their potential is, what their motivation is, what gets them out of bed in the morning, what they're, you know, would really love to learn about, you're much more likely to be able to make decisions and just take a little bit more of a risk with some of the people that you're moving forward. And I just think, I mean, as the graph demonstrates, it's equally true in the same way that, you know, organizations change, the world changes a lot faster. The world of our relationship with our people is changing so fast that we almost, if we're holding on to things from the past, it's holding us back. So how do we employ people in the future? What kind of employment relationships exist? How do people want to work? You know, what do they want their relationships to be with an employer? Do they even want an employer? And I think those are the sorts of things that we're grappling with. And until we really get that deep understanding of what people want and what gets them out of bed and what actually will get them excited, you know, we can't be brave about it or be as creative as we might be. So I think in the same way that it's understanding customers and taking lead, it's also around our own people.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely. Thanks for making sure we didn't miss that point, because it's really important. We can only ever grow or transform at a relatively steady rate if we only ask people to do things that we definitely know they can already do. So it's gonna, you know, your people need to grow at a rapid rate as well. And for that, as Jill said, yeah, you need to take risks on people. Absolutely. Thank you for adding that in. So the questions that you might want to ask yourself around this then, so it's asking, well, when is the last time we spent a day with, you know, customer, end user, employee, even, to really understand what's going on for them? What is their world really looking like? And Jill, you said it really eloquently there, you know, having that depth of understanding will give you the confidence to be able to predict how people might respond to uncertain things in the future and to take a few risks, knowing how it might land with them. Yeah, so other reflective questions sort of we got there. So that stretch point that Jill just made, that belief in potential, and in fact we toyed with calling leap of faith belief in potential. It's very much about that, you know, helping people to grow at a rapid rate along with the organisation. And go beyond the data. Yeah, be creative, be novel. And we're not going to be market leaders unless we do that. We'll often be just following rather than leading if we're not throwing in a bit of creativity. Any final points from you, Jay? You look like...
I mean, I think it's probably for me, the real correlation here is around getting into, I suppose, the cognitive diversity thing, you know, because I think a lot of the conversations we were having in organizations or the data that we looked at were very much about people making assumptions about that person or that person, and those were the things that limit leaders in the organization when they say, well, you know, I've had this kind of job, I'll give it to that person, or I'd as opposed to actually recognizing, you know, having that empathy to see, well, actually, just because that person is a bit introverted and doesn't, you know, do jazz hands in the middle of the room doesn't mean that they don't have an opinion in that sort of, or a relevance in that sort of meeting. So I think it really did get us into some quite different areas around, you know, diversity beyond protected characteristics and far more into, you know, neuro or cognitive. And that was a really tapping into lived experience, and what people could bring was quite a powerful experience for leaders when they were doing that as part of the process. So yeah.
And that's a perfect segue into the next slide. So the final tension is specifically around you know, really building on some of what Jill just said there. So it's the tension between having diversity within your community, and it's specifically community because it's not just your you know, headcount, your employees, but your networks, so that you can adapt to whatever the future may throw at you. The more diversity you've got within that, you know, within your network, the quicker you will be able to adapt and change and draw upon some of those differences, take a different tact. And in fact, it's where the name rapid evolution comes from, because in evolutionary biology, there's some fascinating examples, don't get me started, but just briefly of how nature has managed to evolve at a much more rapid pace than we assume evolution. You know, we assume evolution is really slow. Well, there are a few examples where it hasn't been, where it has been, and they call it rapid evolution, where it has been sped up. And what allows them to do that is the diversity within their gene pool, so that they can branch, they can evolve down any particular branch depending on what the environment throws at them. So, for instance, wolves have evolved to be able to stand radiation in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which previously wouldn't have been feasible, but somehow they have rapidly evolved to be able to do that. And lizards, there's some really fascinating examples of lizards, which of course used to be mostly in jungle, forest, whatever, trees basically, but their hands and arms have evolved really quickly to be longer so they can grip onto buildings, bless them. So yeah, but in our business context, the principle is the same. They're having that, as Jill said, cognitive diversity of networks, of people who might be involved in, could be different technologies that we might want to draw upon at some point in the future. So having those diverse networks and communities. But that is fantastic. But at some point it needs to be honed, doesn't it? It needs to be unified and aligned. Otherwise, we can't be going off and again in multiple different directions. It's wonderful having that uniqueness, but at some fundamental point beneath all of that, or above all of that, whichever way you look at it, we've got to be aligned so that on the fundamentals we are moving in the same direction. Hence the kind of picture of the wonderful murmuration. All of those birds are kind of doing their different thing, but when you look at the big picture, they're working together in harmony and they are basically moving in the same direction with some slight variation around the edges. So lovely analogy. So what questions would we ask ourselves about this then? Emily, if you could just move us on to the next question. Yeah, so that question about cognitive diversity. I know often when we're recruiting, we look at demographic diversity. Are you looking at cognitive diversity in your teams? Jill, I'll stop talking for a minute and let you add more points that I'm sure you would like to make here.
No, and I think it is it really is part of both the process of how we're bringing people into organisations. So what the research says is we need to be more creative about that so that we do attract, hard to reach, hard to teach, all of that sort of thing. But also it's about the wider reach of the cognitive view that we're taking, because what we're seeing increasingly is actually a narrowing of that, not an opening up. So some organisations, the ones that are really accelerating their growth, are really looking in a very wide and inclusive way at, and you've heard of this, people who are actually actively seeking out to employ people who have dyslexia or autism, or really recognising some of the different ways of working and thinking. The issue often is, isn't it, it's that the people recruiting or the leaders in the organisation have got their own patterns of thinking that are limiting that. So it really is trying to break through some of that, and organisations that have really been quite brave and bold about challenging it are the ones where progress has definitely been made.
Good point, Jill. And then the second point there, so Jill and I are often fascinated when we go into organisations and you might ask people, what are the key priorities for this company as a whole? And even for a leadership team, actually, and you get different responses from everybody. So there is that real lack of alignment around what are the small number of priorities. Absolutely fascinating and really useful activity I'd encourage you to do. How aligned are people on the small critical number of priorities? So yeah, I would encourage you to go away and ask those questions.
Okay. So Emily, could we have the next slide? So what we wanted to just pick up here is, research is incredibly valuable, and it's a great activity. It brings up some fascinating insights. But we're an organisation that then has to challenge ourselves to say, well, so what are we going to do with this? And if it's not got relevance or application in organisations, then, it's an interesting read. So what we just want to talk to you a little bit about just for a few minutes is how organisations have taken some of this research forward, what ways there could be to take the research and actually use it for yourselves. So we just want to make that real through some illustrations, really. So, I mean, the first thing I think that's really important is that this research obviously is case studies and academic and papers, etc., etc. And the insights are being crystallized in some, as you can see, some quite specific tensions, but some evidence around those as well. And I think the first thing that organisations have found useful is to kind of almost turn the research around to face themselves and say, look, we look at all of these through a set of lens. If we were to look through the same set of lens at our own organisation, what would it tell us about ourselves? And some organisations have chosen to do that in all of the tension areas, and some have chosen to pick one or two. And what works really well actually is to get internal people to work on that. So to get them to work against a set of criteria that the research provides, but go and look and find. So for example, you know, you could take the tension around experimentation and see, well, are we, you know, what is the process of doing that? And then what is the lived experience of people who are observing or part of it? And what we're finding in that sort of thing is the process is one thing, which is effective or not, and sometimes overly cumbersome and sometimes not cumbersome enough. But actually the experience and the perceptions of people having in being involved in that process or sitting around it is often the really interesting bit. So what often people are doing is taking this, going and finding it in their own organisations and using the research to draw out their own conclusions. And obviously that's leading to, well, why are we doing it this way and could we not do it differently? And each of the tensions lends itself really well to that. So whether it's about enlightened empathy and actually thinking about the lived experience of people in the organisations around how it is to be here and how much that enables me to grow, versus, you know, something that might be around looking at where cognitive diversity is, you know, is sort of woven into how we do things or not, or what kind of biases or awareness of those biases do we actually have. So it's been really interesting for organisations to take the research and just kind of like almost use it as a mirror to turn on themselves, but draw from that conclusions and things that they can take action on. So that's one area. And that data collection can be quantitative, you know, data, you can use the data you've got, or you can get qualitative through getting lived experience, running focus groups, getting people to go and have conversations. And I think that the other thing that's been really useful in the research for organisations, and please bear with my dog, is really using the research to work with leadership teams. So we've done quite a lot of work with some very senior leadership teams to kind of say to them, here's some research. What does it provoke in you? What does it make you think about when you think about your own organisation? Where would you stack up in this area? And where does it relate to your growth strategy? So as an organisation, is your growth strategy about evolution, slow? Are you wanting to have rapid evolution around particular things? Or do you need to? So it actually gets those top teams to be really, really diving into the data, but also turning those questions into their own organisation and saying, look, are we doing too much? Are we not doing enough? Do we need to be more mindful of where we pick rapid evolution? Because evolution will happen gradually, but are there some areas where we need to accelerate it? So that work with top teams and using the data and the insight to really get people thinking has been very useful. And I guess the final area to talk about, which Zara and I are very fascinated by, so we would get very boring about this, but it's about the leader in all of this, because just as rapid evolution refers to an organisation, when we look at the research, the leaders in those organisations, in the same way that the organisations has managed to declutter itself, so have the leaders. So a lot of the work that we've been doing with this research with leaders has been saying to them, where are you cluttered? You know, what kind of groupthink do you bring? Where do you go for your opinions? What degree of enlightened empathy do you really have with your people that you can grow and develop them and take those risks and those leaps of faith? And actually, where are you limiting your own thinking because you're making assumptions, because you have your own life scripts around particular things? And it's really fascinating. So Zara and I talk a lot about, it's almost like the big, you know, lay everything out in your life in a big warehouse and declutter your house. it's very much around leaders decluttering and saying, look, you need to free yourself up so you can think differently, lead differently. And that's been some really exciting work that we've been engaged in. And I think, you know, it really has been a really quite a deep experience for a lot of leaders, but also one that results in some very tangible changes. So those are just some practical things that people have done with the research that's turned it from interesting research into something that actually adds real value into the organisation. So on the final slide, because I know we're coming to the end, thanks Emily, we just wanted to first of all thank you for your time today. As you can tell, Zara and I spend a lot of time talking about this and working with clients on some of the research that's come out. We really believe that research will move people in their thinking in ways that, you know, is evidence-based and therefore people can't argue with. So it's always for us got to be at the bottom of everything that we do. There is an ebook which talks about the research and the research that's being done, which you can certainly download if you haven't already. And we'd also love if you do want to talk to us about how the research might be turned to face your own organisation. We'd be very interested in having some conversations with you about that or telling you more about what we've been up to in that space. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of Zara, Emily and myself for your time, and any questions, please do post them. I know we're running out of time, but also do come back to us to have any separate conversations if that seems useful. Thank you very much.